We are witnessing the beginning of the revived Roman Empire, and over 2,600 years ago, the Bible said this would happen. And today, I'm going to show you where that is. All right, folks, let's get into this one. I can't tell you how excited I am to go over this passage because Daniel, you guessed it, is the one that first told us about the revived Roman Empire that would be coming. And there is so much to say about what the scriptures tell us concerning this. Now, you guessed it, we are going to jump into Daniel chapter 2 because that is the first mention in Daniel of this revived Roman Empire. And I'm going to talk to you all about it. I'm going to show you what the Bible says concerning it. And I'm going to show you actually some things that are happening in the modern day that are pushing us in that very direction. Now, before we do that, we have to go over a little bit of history. And I want you guys to bear with me because the more equipped you are with biblical history, the better you're going to understand how it's actually repeating itself. Now, we have to go back to how the nation of Israel started. It started with a promise. God told Abraham, listen, I'm going to bless you, and from you, many will come. And God made it very, very clear that God would bless Abraham and that a nation would come as a result of the covenant that God made with him. And of course, God kept his word, and Israel became a great nation. We know that, of course, Abraham has Isaac and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob is renamed from heel catcher Jacob to Israel, which of course means governed by God. And this is where we get the 12 tribes from. Now, I should note this because it's very, very important. As God began to bless the nation of Israel took their eyes off the Lord. Now, the study that I did last week through Amos 9, I explained the fact that God made himself very clear that if the nation of Israel would worship and follow him, that God would bless them. And if they chose to deny his word and disobey, that God would curse them. And of course, the nation of Israel chose to be cursed by God, yet the grace of God continues to show in that God promised that he would still bless the nation of Israel and he would still deal with them till the very end and would never allow them to be plucked out of their land. And that's the sort of the conclusion that we read at the end of Amos in chapter 9. And it's a powerful, powerful Bible study. By the way, if you have not watched that video, I would recommend that you go back and watch it. Don't watch it right now because we're getting into this, but you are going to be blessed with some of the insight that you gain from that video. I think it's very encouraging to see and understand how God's judgment works and how God's restoration ultimately works. And that's the lesson that we get from this. So as it goes with the nation of Israel, God blessed them and blessed them and blessed them. And then they got arrogant, way too big for their britches. And they went to the prophet Samuel and they said, we want a king. And of course, the prophet Samuel said, hey, slow your roll, everybody. You do have a king, and he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he is the one that rules over you, and he is the one that we need to be obeying and listening to. You do not want an earthly king, because if you have an earthly king, it is going to create problems for you. You're going to end up paying taxes on top of your tithe. You're going to end up being required to give many of your people to him so that he can build up his administration and so that he can end up fighting wars and so on and so forth. I'm telling you, you don't want this. And the people said, yes, we do. We want it. And of course, Samuel, being grieved and brokenhearted, went to the Lord with it. And the Lord said, give them what they want. It's not going to be good, but give them what they want. So of course, the first human king of Israel was King Saul. Now, after Saul, we saw King David. After King David, of course, we saw King Solomon, and then after King Solomon, we saw his son, which would be King Rehoboam. Now, of course, they all come from King David's dynasty. The only king of Israel that was a part of a dynasty that did not belong to King David, at least directly, would be Saul. But it is interesting to note that by the time you got to King Rehoboam, the nation of Israel was split in two. Jeroboam, who was the one who was leading the rebellion to the face of King Rehoboam, literally led the split that took place, or the civil war, where the northern kingdoms of Israel actually led a rebellion against the southern kingdoms. Now, the way it works is this. The 10 tribes to the north were referred to from that point on as the northern kingdom of Israel, and the 2 tribes to the south were then referred to from that point on as the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, this is really important to note because when this split took place, understand that the northern kings, the kings of the north, the kings of Israel, were not godly kings at all. As a matter of fact, in every situation with the exception of one, every single king that came into power through the murder of their predecessor. I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, but that just shows you how absolutely wicked they were. This is the northern kingdom is the place that produced King Ahab and Jezebel and, Ahab's wife. And I mean, so much wickedness that came from the northern kingdom. And of course, it is also important to note the fact that the northern kingdom perished much earlier than the southern kingdom because of the fact that they did not seek the true and living God. So the Assyrians came in, destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom remained intact for almost another 200 years. And then, of course, the southern kingdom was warned again and again and again and again by God, and actually was told by God to repent, to get their lives right, to actually start obeying the Sabbath of the land. They didn't listen to any of that. And matter of fact, it's really interesting because they were supposed to work for 6 years and they were supposed to give the 7th year the land a rest. They weren't supposed to farm for a whole year. Pretty amazing when you think about it. And what God would do is on the 6th year, he would give them enough crop for 3 years. The crop for the 6th year, he would give them crop for the 7th year that they didn't work, and crop for the 8th year as they were plowing the ground and getting ready for the new crop. So pretty cool stuff, but the people of Israel did not listen. Actually, the southern kingdom did not listen. And what did they do? On the 6th year, they took all that extra crop, they sold it, made a whole bunch of money. And then, of course, they took advantage of the opportunity created by the extra crop, and they chose to plant on the land, of course, on the 7th year. So interesting, they were doing this again and again and again, and for 490 years, they disobeyed God. And so God, through the prophet Jeremiah, goes to the people of the southern kingdom and says, look, 490 years, you've not given the land a Sabbath, so guess what? Saith the Lord, I'm coming and I'm going to take you away from the land. I'm going to remove you from the land because I want my land to have 70 years, the 70 years that you owe me. And so God did exactly that. He brought Nebuchadnezzar in to remove them from the land. Now, this is interesting because Nebuchadnezzar conducted 3 sieges on the southern kingdom of Judah. The first of the sieges was 605 BC. There's some debate as far as the second siege. I believe it was 595 BC. And then, of course, there was the third siege. Actually, the completion of that siege was on the 9th of Av, 586 BC. And of course, that is the very day where Nebuchadnezzar came in and he took the lives of almost 500,000 men, women, and children in Jerusalem, all Jews that were killed, and of course, destroyed the temple and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and exiled everybody out of that area of the southern kingdom. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. There was a weeping prophet who cried concerning those things. He lamented over it, and that's how we get the book of Lamentations. Yes, you guessed it. Jeremiah is the one who wrote the book of Lamentations. Now, there's one fact that I did not go over last week when we talked about the book of Amos that I should go over with you right now because it's really, really important to understand. And that is the fact that in 586 BC, when the temple was actually destroyed, that was not the beginning of the time clock that was predicted by Jeremiah, where there would be 70 years. The beginning of that time clock would have actually been 605 BC. Now, this is really interesting because 605 BC is when Daniel was taken away with his friends. And of course, Daniel had every reason to be bitter about that because Daniel would have been a member of the royal family. Very likely, Daniel came from King David's bloodline because he was a member of the royal family. And yet he had every reason to be hurt and angry and bitter because it's very likely that all of his family were killed and he was taken away to be a slave to Nebuchadnezzar. But he chose to actually shine a very bright light, and God used him, and God actually glorified himself through Daniel. But in 605 BC is when Daniel was taken. As a matter of fact, it's interesting when we get to Daniel chapter 9, which eventually we're going to do a study through there. In Daniel chapter 9 takes place in 535 BC, where Daniel looks at the timeline. He reads Jeremiah and he realizes the 70 years are up. And here he is, 535 BC, and he's saying, God, you made a promise that after 70 years we'd be returned to the land. So what do you want me to do? And of course, that's when God gives him the prophecy of what would happen with the nation of Israel. The 70 weeks of Daniel is what we oftentimes refer to it as. And the first 69 weeks, of course, taking place where the declaration to restore and rebuild Jerusalem takes place by Artaxerxes Longimanus on March 14th, 445 BC. And starting that very day, if you count all of the days that are accounted for, those 69 weeks, 173,880 days, from that very day where Longimanus makes a declaration to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, it takes you to March the 29th, 33 AD, which would be the very day that Jesus rode the donkey into the city of Jerusalem. Pretty awesome stuff. Can't wait to get into Daniel chapter 9 with you. You guys are going to be really blessed because the 70th week of Daniel hasn't even happened yet. And I'm really, really excited about going into that prophecy with you. But interestingly enough, Daniel is taken away in 605 BC. And this is where it gets really interesting because the dream that we are going to read about in Daniel chapter 2 actually takes place, ready for this, in somewhere around 603 or 602 BC. So Daniel has only been there for a few years, and he is sort of in that trial period, for lack of a better term, that preparation period, where he's getting ready to serve Nebuchadnezzar, and this is what happens. So the beginning of this story is really interesting. Let's jump into it. I'm going to do a lot of reading here because we have to establish the context of what happens here, but the summary of the matter is really cool. When we get to the Daniel chapter 2, it's going to be really juicy. I mean, there's some really good stuff here, but let me read this here. Okay, let's get into verse 1. It says this. It says, "And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar," which, by the way, let me just stop to say this. When I say that Daniel chapter 2 is happening sometime around 603 or maybe 602 BC, there's a lot of debate as into, was it a transition from Nebuchadnezzar's second year into the third year? A lot of people think this is actually what we would classify as his third year, which is why we say 602 BC or potentially 603. There's a lot of back and forth with the language, but we know it's around that time. It's because we know that Nebuchadnezzar started his reign in 605 BC. So when we talk about, which by the way, his father is where he took it over from. He was his father's commander. So when we start looking at the Battle of Carchemish and all the other things that had happened prior to that time, Nebuchadnezzar ran those battles, but at the time he was not the king of Babylon. He actually at that time was the general who oversaw all of the Babylonian army. He became the king around 605 BC. Some people argue that it may have been a little bit earlier than that, but I think the number that a lot of us agree on is 605. Either way, let's read this in verse 1. It says, "In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him." So in other words, he couldn't go to sleep. It was bothering him. "So then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spoke the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill." It's interesting because you can tell that Nebuchadnezzar sees the hustle in these guys, and he's like, no, I want to make sure that you really do understand what my dream is all about because it was so disturbing. So guess what? You need to tell me the dream, and if not, you gonna die. Could you imagine how crazy of a feeling that must have been with these guys that are pretty much professional hustlers? Okay, let's look at verse 6. It says, "But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof." And they answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it." And the king answered and said, "I know of certainty that you would gain the time because you see the thing is gone from me." So it's kind of interesting. He's like, I can see through the hustle. Like, I know exactly what's going on. Pretty interesting. Let's go on to verse 9. It says, "But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you, for you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I will show you, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation thereof." It's kind of interesting. He's like, I know you're a hustler, but if you tell me the dream, then of course I can trust in the fact that what you are going to tell me is accurate when you tell me what it means. That's what, in essence, what he's saying. So let's look at verse 10. It said, "The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean." It's interesting, the kind of manipulation that these guys are using. They're saying there's nobody on the earth that could figure this out, and there's no king that would be so unreasonable that they would ask this. Look what the king responds to, and look what he goes on to say. Again, more manipulation. He says, "And it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. So look what happens. He's saying, yeah, nobody can do this. Only God can do this, and he's not even hanging around us. Verse 12, for this cause the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the king is so mad, he's like, I'm going to kill all these guys because they're all hustlers. Verse 13, and the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. Verse 14, then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said unto Arioch, the king's captain, why is a decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. So it's very interesting. Daniel is part of the group of men that were considered to be wise men that were part of the Babylonian Empire. And so they go to Daniel to kill him. And Daniel's like, whoa. What kind of a hasty decision is this? What in the world happened? Tell me what happened. So, of course, this man is going in to tell Daniel exactly what took place. So verse 16, then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went into his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So, of course, Daniel immediately recognizes the fact that they've got a problem here, and that the only way they're going to solve that problem is by going to the Lord and getting the Lord to tell them what the dream actually is. And it's interesting that he goes in to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. By the way, they are known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are godly names, but of course, the way that it worked amongst the Babylonians is they would strip those names, give them new names, and that's kind of the way it works. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And look at this in verse 20. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons, and removeth kings, and setteth up kings, and giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth within him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. I just love this. I love the fact that Daniel goes to the Lord instinctually, understanding that his very life depends on it. He goes to the Lord, God speaks to him, and his instant reflex, like literally what he instinctually does, is praises the God of heaven, declaring truth about who God is, and thanking God for what God actually did, recognizing that it's God's mighty hand that did it all. It's a pretty heavy thing when you think about it, pretty powerful when you just stop for a moment to analyze the significance of what's actually being done in the moment. Look what it goes on to say. Verse 24, therefore Daniel went unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon, and he went and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon, bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. In verse 26, the king answered and said unto Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able to make known unto the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? So remember, during this time, Daniel, at least in the early stages, would have been known by Belteshazzar, because that was a name that was given to him. So again, there was Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego instead of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Kind of interesting thing, but it is kind of cool how Daniel's given name, the name that his parents gave him, goes back to that name instead of Belteshazzar. We don't see Belteshazzar being used a lot. Kind of interesting. So verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and soothsayers show unto the king, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. I think this is so awesome. Daniel gets the word from the Lord, and instinctually he goes to praise the Lord personally, and then he gives God credit when he goes before the king. It's not me. There's none of these wise men that can do it, but it's God who actually has spoken to me. It's a pretty amazing, and I just absolutely love it. I love this. As for thee, O king, this is verse 29, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. The great image whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. Verse 32, the image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So as you can see, if you can maintain a visual picture of this, the image's head is of fine gold, and of course, the breast and the arms of this image are made of silver, and the belly and the thighs are made of brass, and the legs are made of iron, and when you get to the feet, the 10 toes, it's iron mixed with clay. And the area that we're going to focus on is iron mixed with clay in just a second. Let me read verse 36 and 37 again, because it helps to establish a little bit of context. It says, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And whosoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them, and thou art this head of gold. So the Babylonian Empire is the head of gold. So it's very obvious. That's what he's talking about. Okay, so he's going to give us the rest of these. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall break it to pieces and bruise. So he's talking about two kingdoms that come after the golden head, right? You've got the area, the breasts and the arms, and then you've got the belly, and you've got kind of the thighs area. And of course, these are nations that come after. So of course, we know what nations we're talking about. You had the Babylonian Empire that was the head of gold. And then of course, it becomes kind of easy when you start looking at it, because when you get into the head of gold, he's already identified it as being the Babylonian Empire. That means the breast and the arms of silver have to be the Medo-Persian Empire. And then when we get into the belly and the thigh being of brass, then we have to be talking about the Grecian Empire. And of course, the legs of iron would definitely be talking about the Roman Empire. But then there is, it sort of morphs into these feet that have iron mixed with clay. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. So let's jump into verse 40 again so we can establish context. It says, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. Verse 42, and as the toes of feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Verse 45, for as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass thereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is the God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat at the gate of the kings. So these nations are pretty obvious as we look at the interpretation of this dream. We know this is, of course, part of this is during Daniel's time. Part of it is after Daniel's time. We see what happens, especially according to this dream that's in the statue. By the way, we see this again being given to us in Daniel chapter 7, which will be another passage that we go over at some point or another. But what you see is you see the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire is lost to the Medo-Persian Empire. Then the Medo-Persian Empire is lost to the Grecian Empire. And then the Grecian Empire is sort of morphed into or translated into the Roman Empire. But what's interesting with the Roman Empire is that we never saw the Roman Empire actually be destroyed the way it's being described here. And we also never saw the Roman Empire break up into 10 nations or a confederacy of 10 nations or 10 kings ruling over 10 regions. We didn't see anything like that. So we know that this nation still has not come. And that's how we know we're talking about the revived Roman Empire. By the way, how do we know Rome? Like, how do we open it up as Rome? Well, because the nation that followed Greece would have been the Roman Empire. They morphed. And so we know we're talking about that nation. And ever since the Roman Empire kind of faded, it never really failed. It was never destroyed. There's always been remnants of the Roman Empire. So when we use the term revived Roman Empire, we can say that it will eventually revive into the greatness that it was. And it's going to look very different than it did in the time of Jesus's day. So we never saw the Roman Empire be destroyed. We just watched it kind of fade away and diminish, although there are still many remnants of the Roman Empire that have existed into the modern day. So what we know is we know that this empire still has not seen its demise, and we also know that we're going to see a resurgence of it. We're actually going to see it rise up into another empire, into another kingdom, and it's going to be very interesting because this is where we actually get the 10-nation confederation, or as some people might call it, the 10-region confederation. We're talking about 10 kings that are going to be ruling as this revived Roman Empire, and these 10 kings, of course, are going to oversee different regions of the world. Some people say it could be Europe itself, but there are so many patterns that we see in the modern day established that have led up to this. And we're actually looking at the revived Roman Empire right now beginning to formulate. And by the way, I will make this argument. You could go back to as early as the 1800s to begin to see the resurgence of the revived Roman Empire, okay? But I'm going to start to more recent times, maybe around World War II, because this is where significant changes relevant to all of this began to happen, which is going to make perfect sense for everything that we're discussing. Okay, so I'm going back to 1946 because when you get into 1946, you get into the time of Winston Churchill, who makes this declaration that basically says we all went down as Europe, and as Europe, we can no longer be a nation or a series of nations that have sort of this nationalistic interest where we're seeking to defend the welfare of our own individual nations. Rather, we need to start functioning more as a European kind of a national grouping. That was his declaration. He said that that needed to happen. And he said that the path to European peace and prosperity on the world stage was clear. He made it very clear. He said, we must build a United States of Europe. And of course, that was a takeoff from the term United States of America. And of course, that's interesting because that gave way to the very building of this. As a matter of fact, when we hit the fast forward button into 1948, which by the way, that's when the nation of Israel was reestablished, and the repatriation of that, which makes the revived Roman Empire even more significant. In 1948, at the Benelux conference, which by the way, I should note this because it is really important because some people might not know this. When you use the term Benelux, it is a very, very important term to understand or know if you're looking at that history, because Benelux refers to Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg as a group. Okay, so when we talk about the Benelux countries, that's in essence what we're referring to. So in 1948, there was a Benelux conference, and in that conference, a foundation was laid for what we would call the EEC, or the European Economic Community. That's kind of where it started. Now, it's had some morphologies in that time, because if you remember, on March the 25th, I want to say 1957, there was a treaty that was signed, and in that treaty, by the way, it was signed, I forgot the name of the hill, but it was signed on one of the famous hills of Rome, okay? And it was called the Treaty of Rome, and it brought together Italy, France, and Germany. And these nations joined the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium in the European Economic Community. So you've got now a group of nations that's actually growing. So you're beginning to see it. In 1973, then we saw England, Ireland, and Denmark joining the European Economic Community. In 1981, we know that Greece then joined the European Economic Community, which then made it a 10-nation confederation. And of course, if you remember back in 1981, now remember, I'll just tell you this right now, I was like 5 years old. Everybody went nuts. They said, this is the 10-nation confederation, and I don't blame them for thinking about that, right? I don't blame them for thinking that way. But then on January the 1st, 1986, Spain and Portugal were added, and the European Economic Community began to develop a more stringent goal of shaping and forming all of Europe. So 1989, that becomes even more significant, because that's when the Berlin Wall was dismantled and the Soviet Union was dissolved 2 years later. By the way, I want to make this very known. That happened under the leadership of George Bush Sr., who was a super evil man. There was nothing about that guy that was right. And of course, that's when a lot of promises were made to Russia, where basically there would be certain guarantees made to them concerning their security after the dismantling of the USSR, but we never kept any of those promises. Nobody kept those promises. NATO was formed early on as a strategy to kind of defend itself, and all the nations in NATO to defend itself against the USSR. And when the USSR failed, there was a promise, or when it was dissolved, there was a promise that was made to Yeltsin and Gorbachev that basically said, we're not going to expand NATO. And literally almost right away, they started on the expansion of NATO. That's why Ukraine is what it is right now. That's why Georgia is what it is right now. That's why we're seeing what happened in the Donetsk region. There's so many things about this that are very complicated, but they all go back to all of these things, okay? And so on, I believe it was the last day of 1992, the economic borders that existed between the nations of what they called the EEC was actually removed. So in other words, this is where we began to see the formation of the euro, basically. That's kind of what started happening, okay? And it's kind of interesting, because that's when the European Union was formed, literally almost a day after, like a few days after it, in 1993, the European Union was formed, and the European Economic Community joined the European Union, which is why we no longer hear the term European Economic Community. As a matter of fact, when they joined the European Union, they for a little while called it the European Community, but that didn't last very long. Now, in 1995, we know for a fact that there were several other nations that were added to the European Union. Austria, Finland, and Sweden, they were added. In 2002, if you remember, that's when they made 80 billion coins that were produced. And it's interesting, the whole purpose of these coins being produced is to create, in essence, what was known as the solidification of the euro that they had been talking about since as early as 1993. If you remember, they were talking about the euro for a very, very, very long time early on, and then the manifestation of the actual euro would have been in 2002 when they made those coins. And it was interesting because it did some really crazy things to the US dollar. Lots of interesting stuff there. Then in May of 2004, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia all became members of the European Union. Because of this, the expansion of the European Union just increased by hundreds of millions, right? Which, by the way, at that point surpassed the size of North America. Because even if you look at the population of the United States, Canada, and Mexico now, back then it was not that way. And the European Union actually was a lot bigger, all the nations represented in the European Union. And of course, if you remember Romania and Bulgaria in 2007, there was some implications with the Olympics and how that happened. But in 2007, Romania and Bulgaria joined the European Union. And of course, if you could remember in 2009, that's when the phrase European Economic Community, which had become European Community, was erased. And at that point, it was now called the European Union. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, I think Croatia joined a few years later. And then, of course, some things have happened since then. Now, what's really interesting in this and what's really, really important to understand is that all of these world powers are beginning to form. And what's become very, very significant now with the European Union is there's a lot of discussion now they're talking about consolidating. There's a globalist mindset. There's an idea that says we have to take the size of the European Union. We need to break it down to regions. And they're now beginning to open it up to have other people around the world join the union and allow the European Union to now be the actual world ruler. And they're going into this. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of talk going on right now about Europe being the center of power. And if you actually look at the World Economic Forum, that is their goal. Their goal is to remove the United States of America and any other world power, and that there won't be any world powers because the European Union, in essence, or a group of nations will be the combined rulers of it. I think that's where we're going to get the 10 nations or the 10 regions, what you might want to call it. But it's very interesting. And folks, the reason why I bring all this stuff up is because we are watching the beginning of Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 come to life. Now, there's something that should be said about this. And this is the take home, right? This is the thing that should just bless you and encourage you and excite you. It's really big. Okay, you ready? Here it is. Get this. Okay? Jesus is coming soon. You should be excited. You should be encouraged. The word of the Lord is real. We are living in the most exciting time to be in this world. There is no greater time to be alive on this earth than the time that we are watching right now, because we are watching the beginning of the end. And when the end happens, it's going to be glorious. And folks, this is the best time ever to be fighting the good fight. This is the best time ever to be doing the things that God has called us to do. Why? Because we are rapidly approaching the final day. It's exciting stuff. Let's get in it, folks. God is good, and he continues to do an amazing work all over this world, and more importantly, in our hearts. This is exciting stuff. Study the word. The answers are always there. God bless you.